Hi, for this week's discussion, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting the Puerto Rican and Mexican diasporas. So, this particular question stood out to me because I remember as a younger student and the daughter of two Mexican undocumented immigrants, I remember thinking it was unfair that, does this category of Latinos got US status? In my head, I thought it just didn't make sense that my parents, who came from a country that still benefited the US greatly, did not get that same kind of status as people who came from Puerto Rico. But clearly now I understand that the principal difference is that essentially, and for simplicity's sake, Puerto Rico belongs to the United States. And that is probably one of the most significant differences because, as Professor Zapata and Gonzalez mentioned, their condition is more similar to African American and Native American conditions than to other Latinos, as their citizenship status is as ambiguous to the US government as it is to any other person. So, this quote was taken from Module 5 lecture summary, by the way. And so I think that citizenship is a huge contrasting factor because migration, but particularly undocumented migration, is a huge part of other Latinx subgroups, especially Mexican. And even though both Professor Zapata and Gonzalez mentioned that a very large chunk of the legal migration in the US is Mexican, followed by German, there is still that gray area that is unreported, which is a different situation from Puerto Rican populations who are, automatically legal. However, the legalities of migration don't necessarily mean that their populations are more heard because, there's still their limited democratic participation rights. Another similarity that I found between Puerto Rican and Mexican populations is that the migration patterns are very circular. And this idea of circular migration is taken from Module 6 when Professor Zapata explains that families would not just move to one place and instantly assimilate and then completely forget about their background. Like Mexicans, Puerto Ricans split up, but they continue communication between their families back home, between people that they have now met, which is a big reason for why they were being able to create their barrios, as explained on pages 88 through 93, 95. Puerto Ricans were able to keep their kinship alive by building and almost claiming some areas as their cultural locations. So this kind of leads me to another area, which is a key distinction between the two diasporas is the actual geographic location. There's clearly a much higher population of Mexicans in the southwestern areas than the East Coast, and at the same time, there's a higher concentration of Puerto Ricans in the East, such as New York, which was mentioned in the text, and New Jersey. And this largely has to do with how the two subgroups even got to these places in the first place. So with Mexico, we know that these southwestern U.S. states were annexed, but at one point were literally Mexico. So, whether mestizo or indigenous, the reason that there is that high concentration is because Mexicans have started in these areas to begin with. Like, they were already there. And then the Anglo settlers came to them. Patterns of migration only followed thereafter because of things such as, families from the braceros who were able to bring their families back and forth, or maybe like migrant workers being in one area and then letting the people in Mexico know, which followed, which kind of goes back to this idea of circular migration. So also another big thing was that Anglo settlers who would come to, California or parts of Texas, they would then they would reproduce with Mexican women who owned the ranchos, which only helped produce a more, more Mexican populations because of that interracial reproduction. And so, on the other hand, Puerto Rican populations did migrate, so they were not necessarily there to begin with. In New Jersey, those were taken by indigenous people to begin with, but not necessarily Puerto Rican. And this is because, they were living on Puerto Rico, on their island. And the way Chapter 4, kind of taking it back to last week, makes it out is that really Puerto Rico had no big issues staying there. And obviously this is like super general and there were a lot of flaws in their system. But Puerto Ricans really started seeing emigration when U.S. got involved because of its own interests. So with the sugar and tobacco plants the U.S. overtook, one that created job disparities that led to people wanting to leave. It created to conflict between the citizens and their leaders, which was, kind of already there, but by the U.S. infiltrating it even more, that just caused even more issues. So yeah, the way the U.S. got involved with their politics was, and honestly still really is, messy, but ultimately leaves the citizens harmed the most. And even though there are arguments that Puerto Rico should be dependent or, independent, the U.S. tries to interfere, and it honestly goes back to the boomerang effect that Gonzalez was talking about, because U.S. initiatives try to fix or shut something down in Puerto Rico by throwing all of these initiatives, but ultimately it ends up hurting the citizens the most, to the point where they actually have to end up coming, which is what the U.S. is trying to avoid anyway. So it's like they're pushing these things, and then the citizens are being hurt, so they're coming to the East Coast areas where they have already kind of settled to find this place of refuge, which is similar to Mexican populations, but not so much, because this is the U.S. taking control of their politics and political and market systems. And so lastly, I just wanted to touch on the racism and segregation of the two diasporas, because though the two separate groups of Latinos both still experience it in similar ways, the history of it kind of is a little bit different, I guess. So in chapter 4, Gonzalez discusses the differences of struggles that Puerto Ricans face from first to third generation. And something he highlights is that even though the oppression is maybe less direct, as it was in the past, generations still have to suffer through institutional oppression that has been left over from the past. And so some of these things include inferior schools, a lack of jobs, underfunded social services, and neighborhoods inundated with drugs and violence. And this is a quote on page 95. And though he was talking about Puerto Rican populations in this particular chapter, I think we can all agree that this is something that affects the Mexican population as well, and really just any migrating group. But yeah, those were the main differences that I found, was just kind of how these populations got to their two areas. With, the case of Mexico, that's kind of complicated because that area was already settled by these people, and then after they were eventually pushed out, previous patterns of migration led to people bringing in more populations and or, breeding with the Anglos or maybe the indigenous to create that mestizo. And so I think that this was a really interesting question, because it kind of made me look at the differences between, the way I took it, I saw the differences between the struggles that are now left over between the two migration patterns. And yeah, that's essentially the summary I have for chapters 4 and 5, and then this discussion question.